On December 19th, 1944, the atmosphere inside the damp, drafty barracks at Verdun was suffocating. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the palpable tension of men who knew they were staring into the abyss of a catastrophe. Dwight D. Eisenhower had called a desperate meeting of the Allied High Command. Outside, the winter sky was leaden, mirroring the grim mood in the room. The Germans were winning. The American lines, thought to be impenetrable, were broken. The massive German offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, had driven a wedge 60 miles deep into the Allied front, threatening to split the British and American armies and capture the vital supply port of Antwerp. Ike turned to Lieutenant General George S. Patton, the commander of the Third Army, and asked the question that would define the rest of the war in Europe. He asked how long it would take for Patton to disengage his forces from their current battle in the Saar region, turn his entire army 90 degrees to the left, and attack north into the underbelly of the German advance. The question hung in the cold air, heavy with impossibility. Everyone in the room, General Omar Bradley, General Jacob Devers, Air Chief Marshal Tedder, knew exactly what that request implied. It was a logistical nightmare. In military terms, wheeling an army of that size is akin to trying to turn a battleship around in a bathtub while under fire. Patton's Third Army was 100 miles to the south, fully committed to a brutal slugging match against the Siegfried Line. To help the surrounded 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, Patton would have to stop an attack in progress, pull 3 divisions out of the line, pivot them on a dime, march them over icy roads through the worst winter storm in decades, and launch a new assault against the strongest German armored concentration since D-Day. The other generals at Verdun looked at the large situation map pinned to the wall. They did the mental math, calculating road capacity, fuel tonnage, and march rates. 2 weeks minimum, they thought. Perhaps 3 if the blizzard conditions continued to ground the Allied Air Force. To attempt it sooner would risk disorganized chaos. Patton didn't hesitate. He looked Eisenhower in the eye and said, "I can attack on the morning of December 22nd, 3 days." The room went silent. The only sound was the crackling of the coal stove in the corner. General Omar Bradley, Patton's superior, scowled, thinking Patton was grandstanding again, making promises he couldn't keep for the sake of glory. British officers exchanged skeptical, almost pitying glances. Even Eisenhower, who knew Patton's capabilities better than anyone, seemed surprised by the sheer audacity of the confidence. But Patton wasn't bluffing. He wasn't guessing. He had already prepared 3 complete detailed attack plans. His staff had worked through the contingencies. He knew exactly which divisions would move, which secondary roads they would use to avoid congestion, and precisely where they would hit the exposed German flank. What none of the Allied commanders in that smoke-filled room knew was that 50 miles away, in a bunker hidden within the Eifel forests, German intelligence officers were holding their own meeting, and they were making calculations that would ultimately cost Germany the entire offensive. These were men of the Times, Wehrmacht, Times General Staff, trained in the precise, mathematical art of war. They were looking at the same maps, the same distances, and the same weather reports. They were certain, absolutely certain, that Patton couldn't arrive for at least 2 weeks. They were banking their entire strategy, the very survival of the Third Reich, on that assumption. They were catastrophically wrong. Why was the German calculation so flawed? It wasn't incompetence, it was a mirror imaging error. The German analysis was rooted in their own rigid doctrine. For a German army to shift its axis of advance by 90 degrees, it required extensive preparation. Units had to be pulled from the line one by one to avoid gaps. Supply dumps had to be physically relocated. Artillery had to be recalibrated and moved in sync with the infantry. In the German military tradition, this was a deliberate, methodical process that took weeks to organize. They assumed the Americans, with their heavy reliance on logistics and massive supply tails, would be even slower. They assumed Patton would need time to plan, time to coordinate, time to build up mountains of supplies before daring to move. They had seen American caution before. They expected more of the same. But Patton wasn't cautious. He was a predator. And what the Germans didn't know was that Patton had been preparing for exactly this nightmare scenario since mid-December. While other commanders were surprised by the German attack, Patton had watched the buildup in the Ardennes with a growing sense of unease. He had studied the intelligence reports that everyone else at SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, was dismissing as ghost soldiers. On December 12th, 4 full days before the first German tank crossed the line, Patton had called his staff together. He told them, with prophetic clarity, that the Germans were going to attack through the Ardennes. And when they do, he growled, Eisenhower will be screaming for the Third Army to bail him out. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, was the unsung hero of this moment. Koch had been meticulously tracking German rail movements and radio intercepts for weeks. He had identified the concentration of panzer divisions hiding in the Eifel. He had warned of an impending offensive when others were planning their Christmas leave. Because Patton trusted Koch implicitly, he acted on the intelligence before the first shot was fired. Patton told his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, to prepare contingency plans immediately. He wanted 3 distinct operational plans for turning the army north, codenamed distinctively to avoid confusion. 1 plan for attacking at Arlon, 1 for Luxembourg, 1 for Diekirch. General Gay initially thought Patton was being paranoid. The Third Army was in the middle of a successful offensive toward the German border. Preparing for a completely different operation in the opposite direction seemed like a waste of precious staff time, but Gay knew better than to argue with the old man. For a week, while the Third Army fought in the Saar, Patton's staff worked double shifts in secret. They mapped out road networks that could support heavy tanks. They calculated fuel consumption rates for a 100-mile march in snow. They identified which divisions could move fastest and which would need more time to refit. By December 18th, when the German offensive was 2 days old and the scale of the Allied crisis was becoming terrifyingly clear, Patton's plans were already complete. He had 3 fully developed operations ready to execute. All he needed was a telephone call. So, at the Verdun meeting on December 19th, when Eisenhower asked how quickly he could attack, Patton didn't need to guess. He already knew the answer because he had wargamed it. He had the logistics worked out down to the gallon of gasoline. He had briefed his division commanders to be ready for a sudden shift. The morning of December 22nd, Patton said, 3 days. And he meant every word. The German intelligence officers, who were calculating that Patton needed 2 weeks, had no idea they were dealing with a commander who had already done the homework. They had no idea that American logistics, when pushed by a will as forceful as Patton's, could move with a speed that defied the textbooks. They were about to learn a very hard lesson in modern mobile warfare. By December 20th, the situation at the vital crossroads town of Bastogne had deteriorated from critical to desperate. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division, were completely surrounded. German forces had cut every road into the town, sealing the donut, as the defenders called it. Inside the perimeter, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the surrounded American forces. He had about 18,000 men, dug into frozen foxholes in the woods and basements of the town. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. They were running critically low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Most of the men didn't have proper winter gear. They were shivering in summer-weight uniforms as temperatures plummeted below zero. The weather was too atrocious for air resupply. The sky was a solid blanket of gray fog that grounded the C-47 transport planes. Inside the perimeter, it was getting quieter. Not because the fighting had stopped, but because the Americans were running out of bullets. Every shot had to count. Artillerymen were rationing shells, firing only when targets were directly threatening their lines. They were listening to the terrifying, grinding sound of German tank tracks getting closer, wondering if anyone on the outside even knew they were still alive. On December 22nd, confident that the Americans were broken, German commanders sent McAuliffe a formal surrender demand. The message was polite but emphasized the hopelessness of the American position, threatening total annihilation by German artillery if they refused. The Germans gave McAuliffe 2 hours to decide. McAuliffe's response became the most legendary monosyllable in American military history. "Nuts," he wrote back. When the German officers received the note, they were confused. They asked the American colonel delivering the message for a translation. "It means go to hell," the colonel explained. The Germans were stunned by the defiance. But McAuliffe's bravado didn't change the tactical reality on the ground. His men were still surrounded. German artillery began pounding the town with renewed fury, turning buildings into rubble. Casualties were mounting, and the aid stations were overflowing with wounded men who couldn't be evacuated. Without relief, Bastogne would eventually fall. It was a mathematical certainty. Major General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the German 5th Panzer Army, knew this. He was an aristocrat, a brilliant tactician. and he was confident he could crush the Bastogne pocket before any American reinforcements could interfere. His intelligence reports still showed Patton's Third Army at least 10 days away, bogged down in the south. What von Manteuffel didn't know, what he couldn't possibly conceive, was that at that exact moment, the impossible was already happening. Patton's Third Army was moving. It was a movement of biblical proportions. 3 divisions, approximately 133,000 men, were disengaging from combat in the Saar and executing the Great Pivot. The 4th Armored Division was the spearhead, leading the advance. The 26th Infantry Division and the 80th Infantry Division were following close behind. But it wasn't just combat troops. Behind them, the entire Third Army logistics system, the tail that wagged the dog, was pivoting to support the new operation. German reconnaissance aircraft, risking flight in the terrible weather, spotted some American movement on December 20th and 21st. But the visibility was poor, obscured by snow squalls and low clouds. The Germans couldn't get a clear picture of what was happening below. Their ground intelligence reported American activity in the Arlon area, about 25 miles south of Bastogne. However, the reports were fragmentary and confusing. German intelligence officers concluded it was probably local repositioning, perhaps a reserve unit moving up, but certainly not a major offensive. They still believed Patton was fully engaged in the Saar. They still believed relief was at least a week away. They were making life or death decisions based on assumptions that were already obsolete. What Patton was attempting was unprecedented in American military operations and rare in the history of modern warfare. He was moving an entire Army Corps 90 degrees across a 75-mile front in the middle of winter during active combat. The logistics were staggering. Third Army had to move 133,000 men, 11,000 vehicles, and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. They had to do it on icy, narrow roads in sub-freezing temperatures, with limited daylight hours. The road network was the first major problem. There were only a few good paved roads running north from the Saar to the Ardennes. Every single one of them would be packed with vehicles moving bumper to bumper for days. Patton's staff had calculated that if they used every available road, lane, and cow path, they could move 1 division every 24 hours. The 4th Armored would go first to punch the hole. The infantry divisions would follow to widen the breach. Traffic control became the most critical mission of the operation. Military police were positioned at every intersection, shivering in the snow, waving flashlights to direct the endless columns of tanks and trucks. Officers with maps stood on jeep hoods, screaming directions to keep the flow moving. Any breakdown, any accident, any jackknife trailer would create a massive traffic jam that could stall the entire offensive. The weather made everything harder. Temperatures were well below freezing. The roads were covered with sheets of ice hidden under fresh snow. 30-ton Sherman tanks slid like hockey pucks. Supply trucks skidded into ditches. Drivers fought to keep their vehicles on the road, their hands frozen to the steering wheels. But Patton's officers had trained for this. The Third Army had a reputation for aggressive logistics. His quartermasters knew how to move supplies faster than any other army in the European theater. His division commanders knew how to push their men to the breaking point without breaking them. The move also exposed a massive strategic risk. Turning north meant Patton's southern flank was completely open to a German counterattack. If the Germans realized what was happening and struck the exposed side of the column, they could cut the Third Army in half. Patton's staff warned him repeatedly about the danger. Patton dismissed their concerns with a wave of his hand. He told Eisenhower the Germans should be worrying about their own flanks, not him worrying about his. "If they hit my flank," he said, "I'll just turn and eat them up." On December 20th, the great movement began. At 4 a.m., in the pitch black of a winter night, the first elements of the 4th Armored Division started rolling north. Behind them, an endless stream of vehicles followed, headlights off to avoid detection, guided only by cat eyes' tiny slits of light on the vehicle ahead. The column stretched for miles, a river of steel flowing through the snow. Drivers were falling asleep at the wheel from sheer exhaustion. Officers walked up and down the stalled lines, physically waking men up, shouting, banging on helmets to keep them moving. They knew the stakes. They knew that if they stopped, the men in Bastogne died, so they kept driving. German reconnaissance pilots spotted parts of the movement on December 21st, but they still didn't grasp the scale. They reported increased American activity south of Luxembourg, but failed to identify it as a full army on the march. Von Manteuffel's intelligence staff received the reports and dismissed them as insignificant. One officer wrote in the Daily Intelligence Summary that these were local adjustments with no major threat to their southern flank. They had no idea that the largest American operational movement of the war was happening right in front of them. They had no idea that their 2-week calculation was about to be shattered in less than 3 days. The German failure to detect Patton's movement wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of systemic intelligence failures that would cost them the battle. The Times Luftwaffe Times had virtually no air reconnaissance capability left by December 1944. Allied air superiority meant German planes couldn't fly during daylight without being shot down. The few night reconnaissance missions provided limited, grainy information. German ground intelligence was almost as blind. The rapid advance of the Bulge had outrun their intelligence networks. They were operating in newly captured territory where they had no agents, no local informants, and no signal intercepts. Patton had made their job even harder by enforcing total radio silence during the entire movement. The Third Army, which normally generated constant radio traffic for coordination, suddenly went dark. German signal intelligence units frantically searched the airwaves for the missing army, but found only static. The sudden electronic blackout of an entire American army terrified the smarter German intelligence officers, who realized they had lost track of over 130,000 men. Silence in war is often more dangerous than noise. Von Manteuffel's staff had calculated Patton's arrival time based on rational assumptions about American operational tempo. Those assumptions were wrong, because Patton was willing to accept risks that rational commanders avoided. He moved his divisions while they were still in contact with the enemy. He shifted his logistics system on the fly. He accepted the possibility of units getting lost or running out of fuel. He gambled that speed mattered more than perfect preparation. The Germans, with their methodical mindset, couldn't imagine an American general taking those wild risks. So, when their reconnaissance reported movement south of Luxembourg on December 21st, they interpreted it as something minor, something that fit their pre-existing assumptions. By the time they realized what was actually happening, it would be too late to stop it. At 6 a.m. on December 22nd, exactly 3 days after the Verdun meeting, Patton's Third Army attacked. The violence of the assault was absolute. The 4th Armored Division hit the German southern flank near Arlon and Luxembourg like a sledgehammer. The German units in the area were stunned. They had received no warning that a major American force was even in the region. One moment they were consolidating positions, brewing coffee, and checking their weapons. The next, they were under heavy attack from an entire armored division. The German 5th Parachute Division was holding the line south of Bastogne. They were a solid, battle-hardened unit, but they weren't prepared for the avalanche that hit them. Sherman tanks roared out of the snow and fog, their guns blazing. American artillery, pre-registered and deadly accurate, opened up with devastating effect, churning the earth and shattering defensive positions. Within hours, the German defensive line was penetrated. The 4th Armored punched through and began advancing toward Bastogne, 25 miles to the north. Patton had given them simple orders: drive fast, accept casualties, and do not stop until you reach the surrounded garrison. At von Manteuffel's headquarters, the panic began to set in around noon. Reports started flooding in. Strong American armored attack near Arlon. Then, multiple American divisions identified. Then, the most terrifying report of all: enemy advance driving hard toward Bastogne. Von Manteufel looked at the map in disbelief. He asked his intelligence chief how this was possible. Patton was supposed to be in the Saar. He was supposed to be 10 days away. The intelligence officer had no answer. He could only stare at the floor. The entire assessment had been wrong. Patton wasn't refitting. He wasn't resting. He was here, now, and he was attacking with overwhelming force. Von Manteufel immediately ordered reinforcements to block the American advance, but he found his cupboard was bare. He didn't have many reserves available. Most of his forces were fully committed to taking Bastogne from the north or pushing west toward the Meuse River. Desperate, he pulled the Panzer Lehr Division and elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division to create a hasty blocking force south of Bastogne. These were elite units, the best Germany had left, but they had to move into position while under attack, confused and disorganized. It was a desperate improvisation. The battle south of Bastogne became a brutal, grinding, slugging match. German forces fought with fanatical determination to keep the Americans from reaching the surrounded garrison. The 4th Armored Division fought through village after village, taking heavy casualties but maintaining their momentum. The snow turned black with soot and red with blood, but the Germans couldn't stop what was coming. Behind the 4th Armored, the entire 3rd Army was arriving. The 26th Infantry Division deployed to the right, the 80th to the left. Patton had brought overwhelming force to the point of impact. The German southern flank began to collapse under the weight. Finally, at 4:50 p.m. on December 26, 1944, the breakthrough happened. Lead elements of the 4th Armored Division, specifically the Reserve Command under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, broke through the German encirclement at the village of Assenois. First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding the lead Sherman tank named Cobra King, spotted the foxholes of the 101st Airborne's 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. The siege was broken. The surrounded garrison was relieved. Patton had done what the Germans said was impossible. The 37th Tank Battalion had fought through 4 days of brutal, close-quarters combat, covering the 25 miles from Arlon to Bastogne against determined German resistance. But they had made it. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne had held the line despite being outnumbered 5-1 and completely surrounded. When the first Sherman tanks appeared out of the twilight, soldiers came out of their frozen positions, cheering wildly. Some were crying, tears freezing on their faces. They had endured a week of hell, constant shelling, hunger, and the fear of annihilation, and they had survived. When the hatch of Cobra King opened, there wasn't a formal salute or a cinematic speech, just exhausted men shaking hands in the snow. The 101st had held the line, but seeing that white star on the side of a Sherman tank was the first time in a week they knew for certain they were going home. General McAuliffe met with the relief column commanders shortly after their arrival. The surrounded garrison could finally be resupplied with food, medicine, and most importantly, ammunition. The relief of Bastogne was militarily significant, effectively ending the German chance of capturing the road network, but it was also symbolically devastating to the German high command. They had gambled everything on a rapid breakthrough before American reserves could arrive. Patton had shattered that timeline. Von Montefeld received word of the breakthrough at his headquarters and immediately understood the strategic implications. He told his staff the offensive was over. They couldn't take Bastogne now. They couldn't push to the Meuse. They would be lucky to hold what they had. His chief of staff protested, arguing that they still had strong panzer forces and could continue attacking westward. Von Montefeld shook his head, pointing to the map. With Patton attacking their southern flank and Bastogne still firmly in American hands, they were no longer in a breakthrough posture. They were in a dangerous salient. Continuing west would only lead to their own encirclement. Field Marshal Walter Model, at Army Group B headquarters, still wanted to continue the offensive, driven by Hitler's delusional orders. But he was receiving similar grim assessments from other commanders across the front. The momentum was gone. The element of surprise was lost. Allied reinforcements were arriving from every direction. On December 27th, Hitler ordered the offensive to continue, refusing to accept reality. The field commanders knew it was hopeless, but they had no choice. They would attack until they couldn't attack anymore, sacrificing the last of the times, Wehrmacht's time strength for a lost cause. But everyone understood the truth. Patton had stopped the German offensive dead in its tracks. He had done it in 3 days when the Germans had calculated he needed 2 weeks. The impossibility had become reality, and the German army was about to pay the ultimate price. Patton believed the relief of Bastogne vindicated his entire philosophy of warfare. He had advocated for speed, aggression, and relentless movement throughout his career. The operation proved his methods worked. Patton told his staff after the battle that the key to mobile warfare was not having overwhelming force. The key was moving faster than the enemy could react. If you can get inside his decision cycle, he argued, you win regardless of relative force ratios. This was the fundamental principle that German intelligence had failed to account for. They had calculated force ratios, tank numbers, and movement speeds. They had analyzed logistics tables and terrain gradients, but they had not accounted for the speed of decision-making. Patton made decisions faster than German commanders. He accepted risks they wouldn't accept. He moved before they thought movement was physically possible. This tempo advantage was more important than numerical superiority. In a January 1945 press conference, a reporter asked Patton how he had managed to move an entire army so quickly. Patton's answer was revealing in its simplicity. They didn't move quickly, he said. They moved normally. Everyone else moved too slowly. That statement captured the fundamental difference in military culture. What looked impossible to the Germans, and even to the British and other American generals, was normal operating procedure for George Patton. What looked risky to cautious commanders was acceptable risk to him. The relief of Bastogne became one of Patton's signature achievements, cementing his legend. It was featured prominently in newspaper coverage back home, reinforcing his reputation as America's most aggressive and effective combat commander. But Patton himself was already focused on the next operation. He wrote in his diary, on December 29th, that Bastogne was a necessary diversion. Now, he wrote, they needed to get back on the offensive and drive into the heart of Germany. The war wouldn't be won by defensive victories. That aggressive mindset, the constant focus on the next attack, the next advance, the next objective, was what made Patton unique. And it was exactly what the Germans had failed to anticipate when they sat in their bunkers calculating his arrival time. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander on the Western Front, later admitted that the Battle of the Bulge was lost the moment Patton turned north. It wasn't just the fresh troops he brought to the fight. It was the speed with which he changed the entire strategic situation. He turned an Allied crisis into a German disaster simply by arriving faster than expected. In the end, the math was simple. The Germans needed 2 weeks to win. Patton needed 3 days to stop them. And that difference cost Hitler his last army. Patton's Third Army went on to drive across the Rhine and into the heart of the Reich, crushing resistance as they went. But for the men who fought in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the turn north would always be their defining moment. They had done the impossible. Not because they were supermen, but because they had a commander who believed the impossible was just a logistical problem to be solved. And because they moved when they were told to move, drove when they were dead tired, and fought when they were outnumbered. As Patton famously said, a good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week. In the snows of the Ardennes, that philosophy saved an army and helped win a war. It remains a testament to what is possible if you have an army, a mission, and the absolute will to win.